The fluorescent light above the motel's check-in desk flickered like a dying heartbeat, casting a sickly yellow glow across the cracked linoleum floor. Leela's arms ached from carrying the car seat, where her 6-month-old daughter, Emma, slept fitfully, her tiny chest rising and falling beneath a faded onesie. The air smelled of stale cigarette smoke and desperation, a fitting backdrop for the wreckage of Leela's life. She'd driven 3 hours from the courthouse, her hands still trembling from signing the divorce papers, the ink barely dry before she'd packed a duffel bag and fled. The settlement left her with literally a beat-up Toyota, a few $100s, and Emma, no home, no plan, just a raw, gnawing need to escape the life she'd known with Tom. The clerk, a wiry man with a stained trucker hat, barely looked up from his phone as he slid a key across the counter. Room 12, cash only. No refunds. Leela nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She handed over a crumpled 20, the last of her cash after filling the gas tank. The key felt heavy in her hand, its plastic tag engraved with the motel's name, Starlight Inn. A cruel irony, she thought, given the darkness swallowing her whole. Outside, the night was thick with humidity, the kind that clung to skin and made breathing feel like drowning. The motel was a U-shaped relic, its neon sign buzzing faintly, half the letters burned out. Leela hoisted the car seat in her duffel, her sneakers crunching on gravel as she made her way to room 12. The door creaked open, revealing a room that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. Appealing wallpaper, a sagging bed, and a carpet with stains she didn't want to think about. She set Emma's car seat on the floor, checking to make sure the baby was still asleep, then collapsed onto the bed. The springs groaned under her weight, and she stared at the water-stained ceiling, willing herself not to cry. Crying wouldn't change anything. Tom was gone, their marriage a smoldering ruin, and she was alone with a baby she barely knew how to care for. The divorce had been a slow bleed. Tom's late nights at the bar, his temper flaring over nothing, the way he'd look at her like she was a stranger, it had chipped away at her until there was nothing left but resentment. When she'd found the texts on his phone, flirty messages to a coworker named Jess, it wasn't even a surprise, just a confirmation of what she'd known for months. He didn't love her anymore. The lawyer had warned her the settlement would be lean. Tom's debts had eaten up most of their assets, but she hadn't expected to feel this hollow. She'd fought for custody of Emma, and that was her one victory. But now, staring at the motel's flickering ceiling light, she wondered if she'd won anything at all. Emma stirred, letting out a soft whimper. Leela sat up, her body heavy with exhaustion, and unbuckled the baby from the car seat. She cradled Emma against her chest, rocking her gently, the motion automatic but soothing. The baby's warmth was the only thing grounding her, a reminder that she had to keep going, even if she didn't know where. She whispered to Emma, promises she wasn't sure she could keep. "We'll be okay, baby, we'll figure it out." The words felt like lies, but they were all she had. A faint noise came from the wall behind the beta, a low, rhythmic thumping, like someone tapping their foot or pacing. Leela froze, her heart quickening. The walls were thin, so thin she could hear the muffled hum of a TV from the room next door. She told herself it was nothing, just another guest, but the sound unnerved her. She hadn't noticed anyone else when she'd parked, hadn't seen any cars in the lot except her own. The motel felt deserted, a ghost town of forgotten travelers. She shook off the unease, chalking it up to exhaustion, and lay Emma down in the car seat, tucking a blanket around her. Leland unzipped her duffel, pulling out a bottle and a can of formula. The motel's sink was rusted, but the water ran clear enough. She mixed the formula, her hand shaking slightly, and fed Emma, who drank greedily. The thumping from next door stopped, replaced by a faint creak, like a door opening. Leela's eyes darted to the deadbolt on her own door, confirming it was locked. She told herself she was being paranoid. Motels were noisy, people moved around. It didn't mean anything, but the unease lingered, a cold knot in her stomach. She hadn't told anyone where she was going, not her sister, not her friends, not even her lawyer. She'd wanted a clean break, a chance to disappear and start over. But now, in this dingy room with its flickering lights and thin walls, she felt exposed, like a deer caught in headlights. She finished feeding Emma, burped her, and laid her back down, the baby's eyes fluttering shut. Leela didn't sleep. She sat on the bed, her back against the headboard, listening to the silence that wasn't quite silent. The thumping started again, slower this time, deliberate. It wasn't a foot tapping anymore, it was too precise, too intentional. Like someone knocking, but not on her door, on the wall. Her breath caught, and she slid off the bed, creeping to the window. She parted the heavy curtains just enough to peek outside. The parking lot was empty except for her Toyota, its dented bumper glinting under the motel's lone streetlight. No other cars, no people, just the buzzing neon sign and the endless stretch of highway beyond. She let the curtain fall, her pulse hammering. The thumping stopped, and for a moment, the silence was worse. Then she heard Ida alone murmur, like a voice, too soft to make out the words. It was coming from the room next door, room 11. She pressed her ear to the wall, her hands clammy. The voice was male, low and steady, like he was talking to someone, but there was no second voice, no response. Just him, droning on, the words indistinct but heavy with intent. Leela pulled back, her mind racing. She was alone with a baby in a cheap motel off a nowhere highway. She had no phone. She ditched it after Tom kept calling, his drunken voicemails alternating between apologies and accusations. She had no weapon, no way to defend herself if something went wrong. The thought made her feel small, fragile, like the girl she'd been before Emma, before Tom, before the world had carved her into someone harder. She checked the deadbolt again, then dragged the room's lone chair, a rickety thing with a torn cushion under the doorknob. It wouldn't stop anyone determined, but it might slow them down. She sat back on the bed, her eyes fixed on the door, her ears straining for any sound. The voice next door stopped, and the silence was suffocating. She didn't know how long she sat there, every creak of the building making her jump, every shadow in the corner looking like a threat. When Emma started fussing again, Leela's nerves were so frayed she nearly cried out. She scooped the baby up, shushing her softly, and paced the room, her bare feet cold against the carpet. The thumping didn't return, but the feeling of being watched, of being known, didn't leave her. She thought about packing up and driving away, but where would she go? She had no money for another motel, no destination in mind. This was supposed to be her fresh start, her escape from Tom's shadow. Instead, it felt like she'd traded one cage for another. The night dragged on, each minute stretching into eternity. Leela didn't sleep, didn't dare close her eyes. She kept Emma close, the baby's soft breaths her only anchor. Sometime after midnight, she heard a new sound, a faint click, like a door closing softly. It came from outside, not the room next door. She crept to the window again, her heart in her throat. The parking lot was still empty, but something moved in the shadows near the motel's office, a flicker of motion too quick to make out. She blinked, and it was gone. She told herself it was nothing, just her mind playing tricks, but she didn't believe it. She sat back on the bed, clutching Emma, and waited for dawn, the hours crawling by like a slow poison. When the first light of morning seeped through the curtains, pale and gray, she felt no relief. The night had passed, but the weight of it lingered, heavy as the key in her pocket. She needed to know who was in room 11. She needed to know if she was safe. But the thought of opening her door, of stepping into the open, made her stomach churn. She looked at Emma, sleeping soundly now, and made a decision. She'd check the parking lot one more time, then decide whether to stay or run. She eased the chair from under the doorknob, her hands trembling, and cracked the door open. The morning air was cool, the highway quiet. Her car was still there, untouched. But as she stepped outside, her eyes caught something new, a pickup truck, old and rusted, parked at the far end of the lot, half hidden by the motel's dumpster. It hadn't been there last night. Her breath hitched. She ducked back inside, locking the door, her mind spiraling. Was it his, the man next door, or someone else entirely? She didn't know, and that was the worst part. She didn't know who he was, what he wanted, or why his voice had sounded so eerily familiar, like a ghost from a life she tried to leave behind. Part 2. Leela didn't wait for answers. She packed her duffel in a frenzy, shoving clothes and formula cans inside, her hands clumsy with panic. Emma woke, her cries piercing the quiet, and Leela shushed her desperately, glancing at the door as if it might burst open. The pickup truck in the lot haunted her, its presence a question she couldn't answer. She had to leave it now. She slung the duffel over her shoulder, grabbed a car seat, and eased the door open, scanning the lot. The truck was still there, its driver's side window too dark to see through. No one moved, no one appeared, but the air felt charged, like the moment before a storm. She hurried to her Toyota, fumbling with the keys, and strapped Emma in. The engine sputtered but caught, and she peeled out of the lot, her eyes flicking to the rear-view mirror. The highway stretched empty before her, but as she glanced back, she saw the pickup pull out, its headlights flickering on. Her heart lurched. She pressed the gas, the Toyota's engine whining, and drove until the motel was a speck in the distance. The truck didn't fall out, or if it did, she lost it in the morning haze. By noon, she'd reached a small diner, where she used her last $10 on coffee and a chance to breathe. Emma cooed in her lap, oblivious to the terror still clawing at Leela's chest. She never found out who was in room 11. She didn't want to. Some questions, she decided, were better left unanswered. But as she sipped her coffee, the memory of that voice, low, familiar, like Tom's but not quite, lingered, a shadow she'd carry wherever she went. The fluorescent light above the motel's check-in desk buzzed like a trapped insect, casting a sickly glow over the peeling wallpaper and stained counter. Leela's arms ached from carrying Emma's car seat, the 6-month-old nestled inside, her tiny breaths barely audible over the hum of the air conditioner. The clerk, a man with sunken eyes and a cigarette dangling from his lips, didn't look up as he slid a key across the counter. Room 12, $30. Cash. Leela fumbled in her purse, her fingers brushing past the divorce papers she hadn't yet had the strength to unfold. She handed over the money, her last crumpled bills, and took the key, its plastic tag reading Starlight in faded letters. The name felt like a cruel joke. There was no Starlight here, only the weight of a life unraveling. She'd driven 4 hours from the courthouse, the ink on the divorce decree still fresh, her heart a tangle of relief and grief. Tom had been a storm, his temper flaring like lightning, his infidelity a slow erosion of everything they'd built. The settlement left her with Emma, a battered Toyota, and just enough cash to get through a week, maybe 2. She hadn't planned beyond that. She couldn't. All she knew was she needed distance from the house they'd shared, from the memories of his late nights and shouted arguments. The motel, a squat, U-shaped building off a desolate highway, was as far as she could get on a quarter tank of gas. The room smelled of mildew and cheap air freshener. Leela sat Emma's car seat on the floor, checking the baby's blanket before collapsing onto the sagging bed. The springs creaked, and she stared at the water-stained ceiling, her chest tight. Emma stirred, letting out a soft whimper, and Leela was on her feet in an instant, her body moving on instinct despite the exhaustion dragging at her bones. She unbuckled the baby, cradling her close, the warmth of Emma's tiny body the only thing keeping her grounded. "We're okay," she whispered, more to herself than to the baby. "We'll figure it out." A faint noise came from the wall behind the bed, a low, rhythmic thump, like someone tapping a foot or pacing. Leela froze, her arms tightening around Emma. The walls were paper-thin, the kind that carried every sound. She heard a muffled hum, maybe a TV, from the room next door. Room 11. She told herself it was nothing, just another guest, but the sound set her nerves on edge. The parking lot had been nearly empty when she arrived, just her car and a rusted dumpster under the motel's flickering neon sign. She hadn't seen anyone else, hadn't heard footsteps or voices. The isolation felt both comforting and menacing. She laid Emma back in the car seat, tucking the blanket around her, and dug through her duffel for a bottle. The motel's sink was grimy, but the water ran clear. As she mixed formula, the thumping stopped, replaced by a faint creak, like a door easing open. Her pulse quickened. She glanced at the deadbolt, confirming it was locked, and told herself she was being paranoid. Motels were noisy. People moved around, but the silence that followed was worse, heavy and expectant, like the air before a storm. Leela fed Emma, the baby's greedy gulps filling the quiet. The thumping started again, slower now, deliberate, like someone knocking softly on the wall. She set the bottle down, her hands trembling, and pressed her ear to the wall. A voice, low and male, murmured from room 11, too soft to make out words but steady. like he was talking to someone. There was no second voice, no reply, just him, speaking in a cadence that felt oddly familiar, though she couldn't place why. Her stomach twisted. She pulled back, her mind racing. She had no phone, yet Tom's relentless calls had driven her to ditch it. His voicemails a mix of slurred apologies and accusations. She had no weapon, no plan, just a baby and a dwindling bank account. The thought of someone next door, someone whose voice tugged at her memory, made her feel exposed, like a rabbit caught in a trap. She dragged the room's lone chair under the doorknob, its wobbly legs barely reassuring, and sat on the bed, her eyes fixed on the door. The night crawled by. Leela didn't sleep, her senses tuned to every sound of the drip of the faucet, the hum of the neon sign outside, the occasional creak from next door. Sometime after midnight, she heard a new noise, a soft click like a door closing outside. She crept to the window, parting the curtains just enough to see the parking lot. Her Toyota sat alone, its dented bumper glinting under the streetlight. But something moved in the shadows near the motel's office, a flicker too quick to identify. She blinked, and it was gone. She sat back down, clutching Emma's car seat, and waited for morning. When dawn finally broke, gray and thin, she felt no safer. The voice, the thumping, the shadow as they lingered like ghosts. She needed to know who was in room 11, but the thought of confronting whoever it was terrified her. She decided to check the lot one last time, then leave. She eased the chair from the door, cracked it open, and frowsed. A rusted pickup truck, one she hadn't seen last night, sat at the far end of the lot, half hidden by the dumpster. Her breath caught. She slammed the door, locked it, and knew she couldn't stay. Leela packed her duffel in a frenzy, her hands shaking as she stuffed clothes and formula cans inside. Emma woke, her cries slicing through the quiet, and Leela shushed her, her eyes darting to the door. The pickup truck loomed in her mind, its presence a question she couldn't answer. Was it his, the man next door, or someone else? The voice from room 11 echoed in her memory, low and familiar, like Tom's but not quite impossible, yet it gnawed at her. She slung the duffel over her shoulder, grabbed the car seat, and cracked the door open again. The lot was still, the truck unmoving, its windows dark. She hurried to her Toyota, her sneakers crunching on gravel, and strapped Emma in, her fingers fumbling with the buckles. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. She pulled out of the lot, her eyes flicking to the rear-view mirror. The truck didn't move, but as she turned onto the highway, she saw its headlights flicker on, the vehicle easing onto the road behind her. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She pressed the gas, the Toyota's engine whining, the speedometer creeping past 70. The truck stayed in her mirror, a distant shadow, neither closing the gap nor falling away. She drove for miles, her knuckles white on the wheel, until the truck finally turned off at an exit, its taillights vanishing into the morning haze. She didn't stop until she reached a small diner an hour later, its neon sign promising coffee and comfort. Her last $10 bought a cup of coffee and a chance to breathe. Emma cooed in her lap, oblivious to the terror still clawing at Leela's chest. She sipped the coffee, its bitterness grounding her, and tried to piece together the night. The voice, the thumping, the truck. They felt like fragments of a nightmare, but she couldn't shake the sense that they meant something, that she'd brushed against a danger she didn't understand. The diner was warm, its booths filled with truckers and locals, their chatter a welcome shield against the silence of the motel. Leela fed Emma, her hands steadier now, and let the baby's weight anchor her. She didn't know where she'd go next. At her sister's place in Ohio, maybe, or a shelter if it came to that. The money wouldn't last, but she'd find a way. She had to. For Emma. As she sat there, a man walked in, his boots heavy on the linoleum. He was tall, his flannel shirt torn but clean, his face shadowed by a baseball cap. He glanced her way, his eyes lingering a moment too long, and Leela's breath caught. His voice, when he ordered coffee at the counter, was low, steady, like the one she'd heard through the wall. Her pulse spiked. She told herself it was impossibly. Tom was hours away, probably still drunk in their old house, but the resemblance, the cadence, it was too close. She watched him from the corner of her eye, her hands tightening around Emma. He didn't approach, didn't look at her again, just sat at the counter, his back to her, sipping his coffee. She tried to convince herself it was a coincidence, that her fear was twisting her perception. But the memory of room 11, of the thumping, the truck, wouldn't let go. She paid her bill, gathered Emma, and slipped out of the diner, her eyes on the man's back until the door swung shut behind her. Outside, the Toyota waited, its engine coughing as she started it. The parking lot was empty except for a few cars, none of them the rusted pickup. She drove north, the highway stretching endless before her, and tried to focus on the road, on Emma's soft breaths, on the future she'd build from nothing. But her eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror, searching for headlights, for shadows, for a truck that wasn't there. She never went back to the Starlight Inn. She never found out who was in room 11, and she didn't want to. Some truths, she decided, were better left buried. But the voice stayed with her, a ghost in her memory, whispering doubts she couldn't silence. Was it Tom, following her, unwilling to let go? Or someone else, a stranger whose presence was a warning she'd never decode? She didn't know, and the not knowing was a weight she'd carry, heavy as the key she'd left on the motel's bed, a small rebellion against the fear that threatened to swallow her whole. Hours later, she crossed the state line, the sign welcoming her to Ohio a faint promise of safety. Emma slept, and Leila drove, the road a thin thread pulling her toward something new. She didn't look back.